and it hasn't gone particularly well in terms of figuring out who won and where things are going. But I think that the 5G space is a fascinating place to look at the world as it stands at the moment, not only where we are in 2020, but where we're heading into the year 2021. And 5G has become a proxy, but also a microcosm for geopolitical tensions and rivalries in the world. And we will be looking at a variety of topics here today. We'll be looking at certainly the rivalry between China and the US in the 5G space. We'll be looking at what 5G will be doing to our businesses, to everything from autonomous vehicles to flex manufacturing to smart cities to telemedicine to machines talking to machines, basically science fiction becoming science fact. And we have two great panelists tonight to walk us through the issues and give us a sense of where we are, where we're going. First, we have Paul Berryman, who joins us from PCCW. He's based in Hong Kong, of course. And we have Scott Foster, who is an Asia Times contributor and also a partner at Lightstream Research. Now, to get things started, I'll ask each of our panelists to answer a very kind of macro general question for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll get into Q&A. The first question basically is, we'll start with Paul. Paul, can you talk a little bit about China's progress in the 5G space and also America's resistance to it and where you think things are heading in the year ahead?
Certainly. Welcome, everyone. It might be best if I start by just saying that where I'm coming from in Hong Kong, as well as being on the CTO of a telco in Hong Kong that's using Huawei equipment, I'm also on the board of two other companies in New Zealand and South Africa that also have Huawei equipment in their 4G network, and each of them have their own challenges in how they move towards 5G, given that situation. But as well as that, I'm also on the board of the Next Generation Mobile Networks Alliance, and you'll see why I'm telling you this in a second, and a thing called the GTI, which is the Global TD-LTE initiative, which was originally set up for 4G, but is now very much immersed in 5G standards and drivers. And I can tell you that since probably 2012, 2013, where first of all, the evolution of 4G then went on to become the specifications for 5G back in those days, there was very, very strong representation from the operators of sort of China Mobile, very heavily involved. And similarly with the vendors like Huawei and ZTE making great contributions. And I think up till now, probably about 40% of all the patents in 5G are held by Huawei. So I think there's a lot of emphasis gone on for such a long time in China, because I think in China they recognize that 5G. One thing to understand about 5G, it was never conceived for smartphones. 5G was really conceived for industrial vertical solutions to the smart cities, to many applications which required ultra reliable low latency, which required really many massive Internet of Things, the devices that are going to be connected to it. And so the whole issue that we've seen so far with 5G is the mass market expectations of 5G performing these magical things. Now, if we just wanted a faster smartphone, we could do that with 4G, just give it more spectrum, because the difference between 5G and 4G has almost the same spectral efficiency as 5G anyway. So if you want more megabits per second in a 5G phone, you have to have more bandwidth of spectrum allocated to you. Now, in China, they also recognized that early on and made lots of spectrum available for 5G relatively cheaply to the operators. And I think that's also been a catalyst for the development of 5G in China, which is why they now have something like, 600,000 base stations built already, and which is way beyond anyone else. So a lot of coming together of both the government, the operators, and the vendors in developing those products, the network. On the other hand, if you look around the world, there's been much lesser work done, and the only ones that come close are probably Nokia in Finland and Ericsson in Sweden. Maybe Samsung as well. They're doing quite well now, and they've caught up quite well. But beyond that, and of course, Qualcomm in the US has been a good supporter of the chipsets that drive a lot of this, and they've been a major contributor too. But in terms of turning those chipsets into both the radio products and the core network products and the whole system integration, the US doesn't have the same. They don't have the Ericssons and the Nokias and the Huaweis and the Samsungs to do this. So I guess that's why they've lost their Nortels and the other vendors from the past, and maybe that's put them at a disadvantage, I think.
And Scott?
Yes, I think that's a very good place to come in and note that whatever the problem is now between the Americans and their allies and the Chinese did not originate from Chinese aggression. It originated from lack of industrial policy and basically being asleep at the wheel in the United States in particular. And in Europe also, Huawei took a lot of market share because of requirements to give the contracts to the lowest bidder, regardless of the fact that two very important European companies, Nokia and Ericsson, were likely to suffer as a result. So where are we today? China has woken everyone up, really, or the Americans in their response to China have woken everyone up, and the market share grab is ending. And it turns out that if you have a bit of patience, the Europeans and the Koreans and the Japanese can build 5G networks without using anything from Huawei, except of course the patents that Paul mentioned. So there are going to be several centers of advanced telecommunications development, 5G and whatever follows. And so I suppose we can start by saying that the Chinese did everyone a favor by getting them to pay attention to what was going on and what was possible and start to react. That's the positive view of it. The negative view is that in the United States in particular, and to some degree in Europe, it's next to impossible to get anyone interested in industrial policy without creating a national security scare. And that's, of course, what they did. You're probably aware that the people that say that Huawei is not a problem usually go on to say that, well, the Western companies are behind. It would take a year and a half for them to catch up, and it would cost 30 or 40% more. Therefore, we should just let Huawei take over the market. Now that's, of course, a very short-term, like quarterly, shareholder value tomorrow type thinking with very little strategic content. But that's the kind of hurdle you've got to get over to get people to pay attention to what is extremely important. So the telecommunications, of course, is a vital leading edge industry. And if you fall behind there, you'll fall behind in a lot of other things, including, for example, autonomous vehicles and all kinds of social infrastructure, like online health services, logistics. And then, of course, with COVID-19, we need more and more high-speed telecom just to keep the economy going. And then finally, to get back to Paul's point about industrial applications. This is part of the Industry 4.0, fourth industrial revolution that started in Germany. and actually, the headlines that you read day to day generally ignore the fact that several German companies, some American companies, and Japanese companies are building industry and factory specific 5G networks right now. And in the case of Japan, where I live, has nothing to do with Huawei. It's NEC and NTT and Fujitsu. So that's where we are now. We've basically got a geopolitical incentive for everyone to work harder and faster than they otherwise would have.
Scott, you mentioned COVID-19. Has COVID-19 in some ways set back 5G, or has it been an accelerator?
Well, I was talking to an acquaintance of mine today who said that in Korea, there a number of people have said that COVID-19 has delayed the build out of the base stations just because of having to take precautions. And the result has been that many people have signed up for 5G and then canceled it, gone back to 4G because the service has been very good. So there is just the inefficiency of having to do everything with distancing and masks and constant testing and checking. On the other hand, of course, there's been an explosion of e-commerce and online services in general, and I think that's going to drive 5G more quickly than otherwise would have been the case.
If I can add to that, I think what we've seen, especially in the areas not so much Hong Kong, but where fixed broadband is not as well developed, and there was a product of using 4G for fixed wireless access, that very quickly we found that there was a 40% growth in demand for fixed wireless access for those places. So in South Africa and New Zealand, and the first real application that I've seen that makes sense of 5G is the fact that it does provide the capacity for fixed wireless access. And that's been very beneficial during COVID, because it's been able to provide broadband access for the people that desperately needed to start working from home and get access when they didn't have that before.
Okay. I should, one housekeeping note, I should mention to all of our attendees that you can send questions in for our panelists to answer. There should be a Q&A button, either depending on the device you're using, at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen. Please click on the Q&A button and send in a message, and we'll do our best to get to it. Another question, let's just get the Trump effect out of the way here, but what would you say Donald Trump's legacy is in the 5G space in the US? Not in terms of the trade war, I just mean in terms of, just basically in terms of US. Go on.
Yeah, one of the things that's happened is it's catalyzed the whole bringing together of heads to try and think about how to come up with solutions. And one of the good things it's driving now, and I think partly also driven by Rakuten in Japan, is this whole what's called Open RAN approach to 5G. Open RAN means where the traditional vendors, which are limited to sort of Samsung, ZTE, Huawei, Ericsson, and Nokia, they provide end-to-end solutions. They provide the radio access network, all the base station equipment, all the transmission, and the core networks. And that has enabled them to offer these solutions very quickly. They may have jumped ahead of some of the standards in order to make this work. And therefore, the interfaces between the radio network and the core are not, are quite proprietary, actually. All right. And so the concept of Open RAN was to fall back on the original standards and specifications and say, let's open this up now so that other smaller vendors that can use commercial off-the-shelf equipment can start to make some of this equipment, and it can be slotted into the network and take the place of some of the parts that were being controlled by the end-to-end vendors. And what that's done, I think the effect is that what the US is saying is we should focus on Open RAN and opening it up to all of these other vendors and such to try and put together 5G without having to rely on not just Huawei and such, but being able to build it based on choosing best in breed or best in value equipment to plug together. Rakuten in Japan, they've taken NEC for their core equipment, and then they're buying equipment from some US companies and some Korean companies for the radio access network and starting to put it together. Now, it's going to take a while because they've got, some of it is working, but whether it can be demonstrated to be working at scale across a very high density urban area type of environment is still yet to be proven. But it is a force of good for, first of all, providing ability for other vendors to come into the game, and at the same time, forcing the other vendors, the end-to-end vendors, such as, well, Nokia and Ericsson have already come out and said they are going to start and open up their interfaces to enable third-party equipment to connect to it. Huawei has not done that yet, but I think the force of the pressure of competitive pressure will ultimately force them to do it as well.
That's right.
Go on.
Sorry. AT&T was talking about that more than a year ago, right? So we'll see what.
A year ago, they were only doing it for 4G. They only just started to launch their 5G product now.
So Scott, what is your take on the Trump 5G legacy?
Well, it certainly raised the profile of the issue. Everybody's aware of it now, and like Paul said, the professionals are working at it. They've hurried up. They're doing more than they otherwise would have done. The general population, understands that this is an issue. By making it a huge national issue and a national security issue, Trump has got the attention of the Europeans. Everybody has woken up to this issue. Everybody realizes how important it is. That's the first thing. And the second thing is probably inadvertent if we consider what Trump is really interested in, and that is it's making industrial policy legitimate in the United States and getting over that hurdle that I mentioned before. And that's, I think, a major contribution to the economic policy making that's going to be involved under the new administration.
I don't actually. I mean, I think what they've done with the industrial policy is good. I think using security was very tenuous, in my opinion, from my experience of working with all of this equipment. Because I mean, when we buy equipment, we normally assume it to be unsecure to start off with, and we make our own security. We build rings around it, firewalls. We do a lot of work to do that, and we also, in terms of protecting it, mix and match various vendors' equipment so that we're not totally dependent on one vendor as well. So I find that was stretching it a bit, the way that it's gone on the security angle. But I can understand why it was done that way and why it's ended up with changing the whole industrial policy because of the trade imbalance between the vendors in China and the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think it was the only way really to get the attention of a lot of Americans. That's the only thing we understand. And so there you have it. That's just an unavoidable political fact. As for security, it was during the Obama administration, I believe, that it was reported that the Americans had been listening in on Angela Merkel's phone conversations. So my question is to you, as the technical expert, is which piece of Huawei equipment enabled that?
I think it had an apple on the front, didn't it?
Yeah, that one, right?
Paul, can you talk for a moment about the extent to which U.S. export controls have affected your own business? I mean, how have these export controls changed your own personal 2020?
Okay, well, in terms of the effect, in Hong Kong, as you can imagine, not a lot. Although it does give us some concern about the future supply position, and if Huawei are not allowed to buy the chipsets and components that they would be normally sourcing from the US, and that will, I'm sure they'll come up with solutions over time, but there is that possibility, and I know that they've been buying bulk ahead of time sustain that. But there will come a time when they might have to, depending on world demand. Maybe the fact that some of the world demand is diminished might actually help them, give them time to produce chipsets themselves. That's what happened in Hong Kong. In South Africa, no problem either. We've gone from 4G with Huawei to 5G with Huawei without any problem, although we do mix and match with Nokia down there as well, so we're not totally dependent. The 4G in New Zealand was actually a Huawei radio network for the 4G with a Cisco core. And so this was done in conjunction with the security services down there to get their agreement to be able to use the Huawei radio equipment. And we thought that it would be a simple matter of just saying we want to do exactly the same with 5G, but that was pretty much the same time that the US started to turn the screws on Huawei. So one of the things that it really did there was hold things up. Now, around the world, some people are held up by making the choices of what type of equipment they're going to buy, and this was certainly a big influencer on holding up those decisions. In other countries, it probably didn't have so much of an effect because the 5G spectrum had not been allocated. So you had to have both parts, the spectrum allocated by the regulator and the ability to make your choices unhindered to go forward with it. So those were the sort of issues that we had to deal with.
Okay, sorry, I just was changing the screen to look at questions here. One question from the audience that might be worth starting out with here is, can either of you give us an example of how 5G improves efficiency or some aspects of production in an industrial setting? Very basic question, but it's worth looking at.
I've seen a number of applications, especially in China, mining applications, for instance. I've seen container terminals where you can have real-time remote control of equipment, vehicles, and machinery under the control of a guy sitting at the desk with 4 or 5 big screens and a couple of controllers, and he can control it all from there, and ultimately it'll be automated. So I've seen that. I've seen one of the industrial applications that we're really working on here, and I think this is a very important one, because in Hong Kong, when we look at all of these applications, and my goodness, we need to find these applications to make and justify the densification of the network that comes with 5G. We'll go from 3,000 base stations to 30,000 base stations. How do we justify that if we don't have all the new revenues? But one of the things that is really driving us, we don't have agriculture in Hong Kong. We don't have the manufacturing that we used to do in Hong Kong. So we have to focus on the things that we can solve. And one of those is the connected car, assisted driving. I'm not talking about autonomous cars yet. I think that's a long way away. But I think there are things that we can do with the connected car to prevent accidents, to stop cars going through traffic lights when they're on red. One of a really cool feature of 5G is the ability to see out of the front of the car in front. So if you're driving along a road and you're going to overtake on a blind piece of road on a single carriageway, you can actually have a head-up display that shows you what the car in front can see. So you can see whether there's any oncoming traffic and avoid accidents that way. But all of those can only work if the latency is very, very low. There can't be any lag. It has to be almost real time to be able to see those sort of things. And the same if you are, and one point that we've seen from that, we could probably save 1, possibly 2 hospitals if we can bring down all of those accidents in Hong Kong. We've done all the statistics. And if we could save 50% of the accidents, we could probably save 1 to 2 hospitals because of those accidents. Now, that brings for me the big question for every operator is that who is the real beneficiary of this? We go out and we spend billions of dollars on spectrum, and then we build this network that costs us a lot of money, and then we find that the real beneficiary is the government we've just paid for all of these billions of dollars of spectrum as well. So it is a big question for some of these industrial applications as to who benefits. But for sure, out there are lots of good examples that will depend upon ultra reliable low latency for things like emergency services, and the massive IoT for putting sensors all around factories and using them to analyze and give you a good example that we've looked at. When an aircraft comes up to the gate in an airport, usually a lot of the delay in turning around that aircraft is that the equipment and the machinery and the vehicles that are needed to turn it around are not available. And why are they not available? They're in the wrong place. The dollies that they put the containers onto might be out at the freight forwarders on the fringe of the airport, and not in the places that they're supposed to be. So if we can put little tracking devices in those, and the tractors that pull the aircraft backwards and forwards, has it got fuel? Does it have a good battery? Is everything there? So many things that can be detected en masse across the whole airport can then be analyzed using data analytics, because data analytics will play a major part in creating value from the massive Internet of Things that we're connecting. And then using workflow management to make sure that the right machinery is in the right place at the right time for the right aircraft. And the same can apply in a hospital for hospital beds and hospital machinery and equipment as well. So these are the sort of things that can come from 5G.
And in Japan, Panasonic and NEC are providing 5G networks for factories, including their own. And that's probably going to be one of the major applications here in Japan. But it's not just that. It's not just the sensor networks in complex factories. NEC itself, many years ago, was a major supplier of telecom equipment, and even in China. And so was Fujitsu. Now their market shares are down to about 1%. But they've turned themselves into service companies and consulting companies. And NEC is now offering a very broad range of services in the area of smart cities. So this includes healthcare and traffic control, logistics, anything that you want to put in a smart city, including the autonomous vehicles when they're available. And so in addition to providing product and services to telecom carriers, it's the 5G development is enabling the entire range of NEC's new product line, which is services, social infrastructure is what they call it here in Japan. So this is the new business angle that is actually going to save NEC from just going the way of the dinosaurs.
That's great to hear from my point of view, because 30 years ago, we were whacking in our first mobile network here in Hong Kong, which was from NEC. All of our fiber optic cable plant in the ground is Fujitsu. All of our telephone switches were Fujitsu. So I know exactly where you're coming from when you say that they moved away from all of that. And it's good to see them coming back in, especially when people like Rakuten are going to be using the NEC virtual core for their 5G. I think it's a great move, because they were great suppliers back in the day. Great.
A number of questions from our audience focus on security concerns, and let me just marry a few of them together here. One person asks about the so-called 5G imperialism, and I guess the basic question is, for both of you, does Huawei specifically really pose the security/spying risk that the US and its allies claim? Are these concerns valid? Are they overblown? Does the truth lie somewhere in between? What do you think?
From my point of view, there's been a lot of research done in this. You know, they have the various evaluation centers in Europe, and especially in the UK, where they do look at this equipment in great detail. The general view of that the people that did look at it was they couldn't find any security backdoors or anything there, but they did find a lot of sloppy software. But there again, I think you can find sloppy software in many vendors' equipment. And so there was some issues around that. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, I think we take the view that all equipment that we buy is insecure. Whether it's a data center, imagine you're buying all of these servers for a data center. They're still open there, and people can get into them unless you protect them. And so if you assume that everything is insecure, we can take care of it. So there are three basic layers that we have to protect. The first thing is the transmission of data. Well, that can be done by encrypting the data. And 5G itself actually has 3 more levels of security than what 4G had. So, and this is a standard. This has got nothing to do with the vendors or anything. So for instance, a 4G handset, the smartphone, has an IMSI, an International Mobile Subscriber Identity number, which up to the point of 4G was never encrypted. If you could detect it, you could see what it was. Now, in 5G, that is encrypted as well. So there's a lot of new encryption levels in 5G to protect the transmission of data. Then we come to where the data is stored, where the servers are, which we have to protect. So again, we can put our firewalls normally at what we call a 3-ring buffer, 3 firewalls, one inside another, that anyone trying to maliciously get into it would have to get through those rings. Now, of course, the vendor could also have pre-programmed something in. There's always that possibility if that were there. And so far, nothing has been found. But you could never tell. I mean, who would have known that Angela Merkel's iPhone was bugged, really? But in that situation, then the best method is to mix and match. If you can have more base stations from one vendor and base stations from another vendor, and multiple cores with different vendors, then you are sharing that risk across a number of platforms, and that's the right and proper thing for a telco to engineer to manage that. So in general, we do say let's assume that everything's insecure and try our best to de-risk it in the way that we implement it. So that's my view on the situation of whether there's a major risk there. Now, of course, the ORAN, the Open RAN initiative that's going on, will very much help to do that. It'll help to make the ability of mixing and matching your base stations in a network, so you're not exposed to one vendor.
Okay, Scott?
I don't have too much to add, except the other day, a senior official in Sweden was reportedly said that the greatest threat to Sweden's national security is China. And I thought that was quite bizarre. And I also thought that statement is probably the greatest threat to Ericsson's business in China.
Oh, yes.
So what are they talking about here? I would guess that at this point, there has been such a scare raised that if Huawei were to allow its equipment to be used to spy on anyone, it would totally ruin their reputation, and they'd lose a dozen contracts in the next 2 or 3 days. So the odds of them doing anything, I think, are close to zero. I have one question for Paul, though. Would the spread of Huawei equipment hinder the United States in its own espionage activities?
How would I answer that? I think I would just say, well, did you know that there's another 3 levels of security in 5G itself? So I don't think it's a particularly a Huawei issue. I think it's a case of 5G is far more secure than ever before.
All right, so it's not a Huawei issue. It's a 5G issue.
I think 5G has got so much more security that I'm sure the security services are wondering how they get the same level of access that they used to get. Not so much for the lawful interception, because lawful interception, you can go through the right channels and the right legal warrants and everything to do that. But for the other types.
So this takes us back to technological and economic competition, and simply promoting our national industries against theirs.
That would be my belief, and that seems to be what's coming out now about it, because the recognition that we've seen in the US about having to kickstart industry again into coming up with it, and you've heard them talking about Open RAN. You've even heard them throwing the word 6G around, which I hate, because 5G is not. You talk about walking before you can run, and 5G isn't even running yet before thinking about 6G. It drives me nuts listening to people talking about it. In fact, 6G, the targets, which are sort of a 10x to 100x increase in performance over 5G, most of those requirements will require some significant physical breakthroughs in technology and science to actually achieve them. So, why people are talking about it so loudly at this point in time, I just don't know.
Another question from our audience is, there is certainly this concern about the potential vulnerabilities of 5G networks. How does the industry at large deal with this perception problem? I mean, is it a communication problem? Is it a technology problem? How does the industry deal with this lack of trust, if you will, that perhaps it is coming from politicians, and perhaps it's not a genuine concern, but is it a PR problem?
I think most of it's, if I can use as an example, the UK, a lot of it came out very publicly in the UK. First of all, the GCHQ folks that had been looking at the equipment, and that said they couldn't find anything wrong with it. So then there was a negotiation took place between the operators and the government to say, well, how about if we limit the base stations that we use from Huawei to 30% of the network? So there is a lower risk from that, and that was agreed. And then I think some pressure was put on the government from overseas, shall we say, and then they came down and clamped down even harder. So then there's a negotiation between the operators and the government again, where they finally agreed that they would stop buying Huawei equipment for their 5G network by the end of this year. And then they would make sure that it's all removed by 2007, which to me is getting towards the asset life of the equipment anyway. So I think they went round in these loops to overcome some of the perceptions. But I mean, that was done quite publicly. The debates in Parliament, in the House committees was all there to watch.
Okay, and go ahead, Scott.
Oh, that's fine. I have nothing to add to that.
Okay, another question from our audience concerns the new U.S. president. Have there been any indications about where a Biden White House might take America's view of 5G, but more specifically China?
I'll leave that to you, Scott. I've heard nothing at all from any point. There's been no mention of 5G as far as I've seen in the last 3 or 4 weeks from over there.
I don't think he's talked about telecom in particular, but he did say, well, Donald Trump talks about the art of the deal, but China perfected the art of the steal. So when he was vice president, Biden was part of an administration that talked to the Chinese about climate change while the Chinese were taking over the South China Sea. So naive is a good word to use without becoming overly critical. Simply not very attentive to what's going on in East Asia. What's going to happen now, I think, depends more on Biden's view of industrial policy and the American economy than on whether or not he's going to be as tough on China as Trump. Biden is an old-fashioned union man, as in labor union. He's from the East Coast. He is a representative and advocate of the heartland or the Rust Belt. He wants to rebuild the American economy, and that does not include indulging China. He's also an Atlanticist, so perhaps there's not going to be the level of technology-specific assaults on China that we've seen under Trump. But he's, I don't think, going to give China a break. And it's also possible that because he is a Rust Belt union man from the East Coast, that he is not going to give West Coast companies like Qualcomm a break either, because that's not his constituency, although it is the constituency of Kamala Harris.
Okay. We have a couple of questions here about education. One is, in terms of COVID-19 and the fact that so many young students and college students, graduate students are being educated from home these days. Does 5G open new opportunities for new education models, whether it be virtual reality technology or holograms? I mean, is there an entire industry that's being created around us that the 5G industry is not even looking at the moment?
If I can add, education is actually one of the key applications, industry applications for 5G. I think, but you've got to look at it as just really bringing the wireless connected devices up to speed with the fiber connected devices. Really, I think it's you're going to get the same sort of things. Low latency will allow you to have interactive virtual reality, augmented reality, and those can be really deployed quite well in terms of education programs.
Okay. Scott, anything on education?
No, I haven't really seen any reports of new projects, at least not here in Japan. There's probably something in the works, but it hasn't really come to the surface.
Okay, now third countries, especially smaller countries, face a very difficult decision here, whether to go with Chinese 5G or China-free 5G. What kinds of risks do you think are involved for these third countries in terms of making their decision about which fork in the road to go, which direction to go in this fork in the road?
If we look at Southeast Asia, that's probably the best place to look to see how different countries make different decisions. So Singapore is a major U.S. naval base. It's of course, naval base by visiting rights, but it's a huge naval base, and they have tweaked their telecom policies so that the major carriers don't use Huawei, and the minor carrier does. So they didn't exclude Huawei, but they're not going to be dominated by Huawei. And then they do a lot of other work with China, so that they're trying to squeak through between the Americans and the Chinese, and not annoy the Chinese too much, and keep the Americans off their back on the security side. And that's somewhat unique in Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese, traditionally in conflict with China, have banned Huawei outright, and they're working with Ericsson to develop their own 5G. And they want this because they intend to turn Vietnam into the next Korea, a major industrial power, and they think they need 5G to do that. The other countries use Huawei, but not exclusively. Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia. Dr. Mahathir, when asked about Huawei equipment being used to spy on Malaysia, said, "Go ahead, there's nothing here to spy on. We have nothing to steal, no ideas to steal, no information. So we don't care." The Chinese have been very good to us. They built an R&D center in Malaysia. There's a lot of infrastructure projects going on, and of course, Mahathir doesn't have any time for the United States at all. So there's quite a range. I think when you get away from American security alliances, the level of concern just drops right off. The Philippines is a unique case because Duterte doesn't like the United States and hasn't for a long, long time, but is finally coming around to the idea that American military presence should remain in the Philippines to balance China. But that does not extend to telecom. They're using Huawei.
Yeah, Huawei is deeply rooted in telecoms in many countries for the last 20 years. They have been around a bit. In fact, the dependency on that and foreign loans and this sort of thing from China is also a big influence. If you look at in Europe, I'm just looking at the Oxford Economics report that came out this week on Huawei's economic impact throughout Europe. They reckon in 2019, the contribution to Europe's GDP from Huawei was 16.4 billion across, because they've set up 23 R&D institutes. They've, if you look at the value chain of all of the different people and contractors and that involved in working on the networks that Huawei supply, etc., across Europe, it's supported 224,000 jobs across Europe. So I mean, these are not small things to just wipe off the table, really. You've got to take some of that into account as well. And I'm sure they've done very similar things in other countries too.
Okay, another question from the audience. We've seen this kind of regulatory crackdown in China over the last couple of weeks. It's been a bit destabilizing for investors, and it canceled the Ant Group IPO. Is there any reason to look at the regulatory crackdown in Beijing and worry about implications for the 5G space?
I don't have an answer for that one. Sorry, I don't know.
I
Scott?
don't think so. You know, the Ant financial issue is all about destabilizing traditional banks. And that would create huge problems for the Chinese economy and the Chinese government. I don't see that with 5G. I don't. What is it going to? It adds. It doesn't destabilize it.
Okay. In terms of the U.S. versus China 5G competition here, how much for smaller third countries, how much of a plus for China is the Belt and Road Initiative? I mean, the U.S., the West in general, doesn't have anything comparable in terms of offering carrots and sticks. Belt and Road?
I'm not an expert on Belt and Road.
Okay. Certainly, China's Belt and Road and overseas development assistance in general, gets their, foot in the door in many, many countries. And Belt and Road, as far as I can tell, is getting a very bad rap in the West because it's a handy way to pound on China. But if you look into the specific instances, for example, in Sri Lanka, where China has made major inroads, you don't see the kind of response that is regularly delivered by Secretary of State Pompeo. The Sri Lankans may have questions about specific projects, but they will say things like, if you want something to get done, use the Chinese, don't use our local guys. And they built this, they built that, and we couldn't do it otherwise. I had dinner with a bunch of grad students who had visited Japan, and one of them was from Kenya. And I asked all of them about Huawei and China, and they said, well, the highway to my hometown was built by the Chinese. The Brits didn't build it. The Americans didn't build it. No one else would have built it. China built it. So we shouldn't just read Western newspapers and conclude that the Belt and Road is a giant scam designed to enslave the third world. It isn't. All those people are adults, and when they borrow money, they know what they're doing, and they have plenty of experience with colonialism. They know exactly what it is. So I think we should be more realistic and look at each country and each project on its merits. And the conclusion, my conclusion anyway, is that it's a big help for China. And if you look at where China is being excluded from 5G networks, it's within the American alliance structure and almost nowhere else. And that leaves the other 2/3 of the world or 3/4 of the world. Now, these countries are not as rich and they're not as developed, but they're there. And 20 years from now, Huawei's going to be there and it's going to be bigger than it is now. And the Europeans and the Americans will be taking back their own market for the most part.
Okay, here's a somewhat technical question from the audience. While OpenRAN will solve some of the data security issues, will it kill the telecom vendors in all countries other than China?
Actually, that's looking at the future, and it's an interesting question. In fact, a very good question, because I was giving that some thought the other day. And it wouldn't. A lot of these new vendors are quite small. Mavenir and Altiastar and some of these that you've never heard of before are coming through with these solutions where they're putting them together. But it wouldn't surprise me if many of them just get snapped up by other of the big vendors. It wouldn't surprise me if Ericsson, Nokia, or even Huawei, perhaps, if they're allowed to, would grab some of these vendors. I know some of the suppliers that are supplying some of the radio network equipment to Japan from South Korea, but they're not Samsung, but could easily, become part of Samsung as part of it. So I think that's the way I see some of these small vendors going in future. They'll be snapped up.
Scott?
Well, the only thing I have to add is that there's nothing much left of traditional business at NEC or Fujitsu to disappear. So from that point of view, they're in a good position because they can move ahead with the new technology, and it's not going to wipe out their business. There's nothing left to wipe out.
Okay. Another question from the audience is about 6G. China is looking to deploy 6G satellites in space. Does that mean that we'll be talking about 6G in the near future, or is that are we getting a bit ahead of ourselves?
I think definitely the latter. It's not just China that's working on 6G. There are lots of places, universities in Finland, South Korea, NTT in Japan have made presentations on this, their views of 6G. But as I mentioned earlier, 6G, if you were to try to look at what everyone's saying 6G should be, it's having latencies which are 10 times faster than 5G, that are having speeds which are 10 times faster than 5G. And many of these things will require huge amounts of bandwidth, of spectrum, and some technological breakthroughs in physics. Now, yes, China has launched a satellite, and they're saying they're going to do some testing of 6G. So what they're doing is the only thing they'll really be able to test, and you could hardly say that it's 6G, but it's the testing of the use of the terahertz spectrum band. That's 1,000 gigahertz. You're up in the bands where the distances it can travel is very short. But there's lots of it available, so you can get really high bandwidth applications with it and very low latency. So they're going to be trying that out, and maybe looking at wide area coverage with it from space to see whether that can be done. But I can tell you this, if the latency that we require for 5G is between 1 and 5 milliseconds, you can't even achieve the 5G latencies when you have a satellite in space. So you can't call it 6G if it doesn't have latencies that we need, which are actually worse than 5G. So I think there's a bit of hype going into calling it 6G. I understand what they're trying to do in terms of experimentation with some of the technologies that might go into 5G. And I think they do say it is for testing, but to say that it's 6G. To say it's 6G at the moment is a bit pie in the sky or in space, wherever you want to put it.
Literally. I should mention there's actually a part B to this question, which is, as China deploys 6G satellites into space, will this leapfrogging effect help China evade sanctions on Earth? It's a creative use of technology.
Yeah. Oh, don't ask me for an answer on that one, because I mean, for me, 5G and 6G, whatever.
Us.
Yeah,
well, my thought on this issue is that quantum cryptography is much more important in terms of getting around current restraints imposed by China's geopolitical rivals. But I have a question for you, Paul. By launching what they call an experimental 6G project on a satellite, perhaps the Chinese are setting a technology goal and finding a way to justify the financing or to focus the efforts made to develop next generation technology and just get the ball rolling many years in advance, which they need to do anyway, and have a project to work on that focuses the energy and focuses the investment and the thinking on more advanced telecommunications. And then the second part of the question is, at the beginning, you were talking about how 5G originally was not intended to be a mass mobile phone technology, but rather a specific industrial application or Internet of Things and sensor networks and things like that. For whatever follows 5G, 6G, or whatever comes out in the next decade or so, presumably that would also be most useful for specific applications rather than general applications for the billion people of China. What might those be?
Interesting.
Do you know, I think there's going to be another one of those things where we look at 5G over 4G and say, actually, a lot of those industrial applications that could be done in 5G could also be done in 4G, which is quite, unless you're looking at the ultra high reliability, low latency type of applications, then most of it can be done in 4G, although 4G might run out of capacity. And I think you might extend that to 6G to say, well, whatever we could do with 6G, you could probably do most of it with 5G too. It wouldn't surprise me if there's also in those satellites some 5G componentry to do some of the experimentation they're doing. But I think that, and they're not the only ones that are doing terahertz type of experiments. Finland have been doing some and proven the sort of the efficacy of doing it, or at least the capability of doing terahertz transmissions over wireless, but very short. I mean, we're just talking about 100 feet or something like that at best. It's very short. So it's interesting to see that they're doing it. I think you're absolutely right that they're trying to make some sort of project to work on as a lead, but calling it 6G, I think is still pushing it, in my opinion. By the way, on the quantum cryptology, I think you're absolutely right there as well. And in fact, people like SK Telecom in South Korea have actually acquired a Swiss company, and other telcos have acquired companies that are doing quantum cryptography. Because, like I said, in 5G, there's these additional layers of encryption, and some of that encryption is optional how you do it. And so, if you can turn quantum cryptography to that encryption, then you're taking it to another level in terms of anybody being able to hack in and decrypt some of that as well. So you're spot on there.
One member of our audience is asking about Meng Wanzhou, who is the CFO of Huawei. Any predictions for her fate in the year 2021?
No idea. That's in the lap of the gods.
Scott, any thoughts?
Oh, only that if Trump's out, things can't get worse for her. Pretty much.
Why do you say if?
Well,
crazy times.
It's over, right? Journalists do not determine who the next president is, right?
But I presume though that the lack of evidence about the vote rigging and everything is about as valid as the national security concerns about Huawei and the 5G equipment. Show me the evidence.
I'll see the evidence. Yeah.
Okay. Another member of our audience says, "Wow, our speakers are so optimistic. What is the catch? What worries you?"
About what?
Oh, okay.
About the potential for 5G.
Oh, no, 5G is going to take time. There are two phases of 5G. The first one can be actually handled within our own capital expenditure envelope that we would normally spend on enhancing our mobile network. And that is basically putting the 5G radio access network using similar spectrum to what we have to use on 4G on virtually the same cell sites everywhere, and connecting them back to the 4G core, what we call non-standalone. And in that situation, yes, we can provide all the services to these mobile customers that have smartphones, etc. But as I said, when we start to move on to these industrial applications, it requires a densification of the network where we go from 3,000 base stations in Hong Kong to 30,000 base stations. We'll go from 4 million customers on our network to 40 million customers on our network, because it won't be smartphones anymore. It will be IoT devices that are connected. And then each of those devices, if we just look at the pure connectivity of it all, then we'll go from $200 revenue per month from a smartphone customer to a couple of bucks per device. Now, how we manage that many devices has to be fully automated, zero touch. We've got to get the costs out of the network and the operations, because if we don't, how else can a telco make any money apart from then moving up the value chain into the industry specific applications themselves and adding value with things like automation or data analytics or workflow? That's the challenge, because traditionally telco is not very good at moving up that chain. And the last thing we want to be in 5G is a dumb pipe, because if we're just a dumb pipe, it's very hard to justify going to that second phase of the densified network. So that's my biggest concern.
Okay, and we're at the 1 hour mark here. So Scott, I will give you the last word.
Oh, well, in Japan, the new Prime Minister, Mr. Suga, has built his popularity by bringing Rakuten into in as the fourth carrier in Japan, and also putting a lot of pressure on the carriers to cut fees. And it's worked. It's made Suga popular, and it's brought prices down. And so the revenue stream is going to be under a lot of pressure from the active government, and also from increasing the number of carriers from 3 to 4. So we're going to have a situation where the revenues are under pressure, but the investment requirements are going up. There was a report today or yesterday about Rakuten and SoftBank spending a very large amount of money on 5G over the next 10 years, and also KDDI and NTT doing the same. Okay, 10 years. So if you're looking for something that's not optimistic, two things here. The 5G general nationwide rollout is not right around the corner, and you better reconsider if you're a major investor in telecom stocks in Japan.
So Scott, if I gave you $1 million of Paul's money, and I said you can only bet on Japan or South Korea for the next 10 years in the 5G space, who gets your money? Who gets Paul's money?
I suppose I should ask Paul. I think internationally, Samsung is far and away the more aggressive and the more entrepreneurial actor here.
Okay, Korea. Well, we'll leave it there. I would like to thank our audience for participating in this panel discussion. I'd like to thank our excellent speakers for bringing us around the world and back, and in some ways to the future and back. Paul, thank you. Scott, thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll see you at the next Asia Times event. Have a good day.
Thank you. Good night.
Good day.